to the second lecture of the Fall Arts and Humanities Lecture Series brought to you by the Foundation of Wayne Community College. On behalf of the Foundation, I thank you all for attending. If I may ask you all to please check to see your cell phone is on silent mode so we don't have any interruptions of our guest speaker tonight. Thank you. My name is Dean Lawson, and I am a history instructor here at Wayne Community College. I am delighted to be here now introducing our guest lecturer, whom I will introduce in just a moment. But a few weeks ago, when I was asked to introduce a speaker coming to deliver a lecture on John Lawson and the Indians of North Carolina, my first reaction was apprehension, bordering on fear. For I immediately recall from my North Carolina history course that John Lawson, my namesake, was killed by the Indians. I'll spare you the gruesome details because to talk about that would be to intrude on our guest speaker's lecture. But in truth, I'm delighted to introduce our guest lecturer, and I'm eager to learn from an expert more about John Lawson and the Indians of North Carolina. Our guest lecturer is Professor David La Vere, and his lecture is titled John Lawson and the Indians. Professor La Vere, a former Marine infantryman, received his PhD from Texas A&M University and teaches American Indian history at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. He is an award-winning historian, author, and speaker. La Vere has written several books, mostly on American Indian history. His most recent book, The Tuscarora War, Indians, Settlers, and the Fight for the Carolina Colonies, was published by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Press. He is currently working on a book about the Tributary Indians of North Carolina. Without further delay, I give you Professor La Vere and John Lawson and the Indians. Welcome, Professor La Vere.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight. Monday night, I'll try and get you home before Monday Night Football. But man, this is nice digs here. I love this. I've never been in a screen this big before. Usually I'm in little county libraries, and they got the little screen that rolls up. So I'll tell you, I'm living large tonight. So again, thanks for coming out. And let me also say, it's a welcome to be. Just I get to take the mask off while I talk. So it's worth it there. All right, so let's get here. So, John Lawson. He's an interesting fellow. Here we are 310 years after his death, and we're still talking about him. Maybe it's the way he died that keeps us interested, but there are more reasons to remember him. He was a complex fellow. He seemed to have a good heart, and even as an Englishman of his times, he would have considered himself a friend of the Indians. But in some things, he could look but not see, listen but not hear. So let's give him the TMZ treatment and look a little deeper into his life, belief, and actions. That's the image of him that comes up if you Google John Lawson. I can't guarantee that it really is him. Taking anything for fact off the internet these days is a loser's game. So that may or may not be John Lawson's. But the image does look right to me. It does look right to the time as well. They were a wig-wearing people. Baron Christophe de Graffenried, who would stand trial with John Lawson before the Tuscaroras, loved his wigs and would wear one even when out exploring the forest. Man, imagine how hot that must have been in a North Carolina summer. So the bewigged figure here could be Lawson. That's backed up by him holding a written paper or a letter which indicates a writer, and Lawson was certainly that. His book, A New Voyage to Carolina, published in London in 1709, is one of the best pieces of travel and natural history writing in the colonial period. It's also one of the best early looks at 18th century Eastern North Carolina Indian culture. If you want to know about early Indian life at this time, village names as well as plants and animals, this is the book to read. It's still in print and easily available. To this day, scholars consider it the top North Carolina history. I believe it's the best book ever written on North Carolina. Ever. Beats mine easily. Lawson was born in London in 1674 to upper middle class parents. Word was his father was a Dr. John Lawson. That Lawson himself attended college shows that he was in a respected social position, that he read, wrote, traveled, drew maps, cataloged the colony's plants and animals, observed Indian culture, served as a colonial official, and published a book that is still read today, shows that he was certainly educated and might be considered a middle-class gentleman, but not an aristocrat. In school, he became interested in plants and animals and developed a talent for drawing them. In 1700, someone told him that Carolina was the place he ought to be, and he loaded up the ship and he moved to, let's say, Raleigh. I know you're my, so you know where that ditty comes from. No, he went to Charleston, South Carolina. Wanting to explore and always willing to get out and rough it, between December 1700 and February 1701, Lawson and several comrades traveled up South Carolina, across the North Carolina Piedmont, then to the Tar Pamlico River, where he made his way down to the coast. He recorded his trip and the Indians he met, and this formed the basis of his book. Enthralled by North Carolina, he remained in the colony and became its ardent promoter and booster. He helped found the colony's first town of Bath in 1705. He would take what we would call a common law wife and had a daughter with her. Politically, he aligned himself with the Thomas Pollock proprietary faction, which encouraged law and order, the influx of settlers, the expansion of farming, and the use of enslaved Indians and Africans as laborers. His knowledge, education, ability, connections, and loyalty soon earned him the lucrative position of Surveyor General of North Carolina. Being a surveyor was a rather powerful position back then. Land was the essence of almost everything in North Carolina. That's why we call it real estate. So an Englishman wanted as much land as he could get, whether one was a lord's proprietor who hoped to wring wealth from quit rents, land speculators like Thomas Pollock, the richest man in the colony, who hoped to buy low and sell high, or a hard-scrabble farmer hoping to get 100 acres or more and raise a family and live as he saw fit. Accurate surveys were essential to a person's potential wealth. So as Lawson and his assistants tramped around eastern North Carolina with their compasses, chains, and pins, there were signs of an expanding colony, heralding the coming of settlers and slaves, a colony more closely tied to the British Empire, despite its shallow waters that made it the poorest of all England's North American possessions. Indians saw the surveyor in a different light. For them, there were harbingers of land loss and conflict. English or Scottish or German settlers always showed up on the heels of the surveyors, bringing with them cattle and hogs that ate up Indian gardens. If an Indian shot the intruding pig, then the settler complained and sued for damages. The colony initiated rules that limited Indian use of fire and who and where they could trade. Two different peoples from different cultures with different ways of going through life often grated on each other. Just basic things like the concept of father was different. Europeans used father imagery to stress discipline, sternness, and authority. Think of me as the great father from across the sea, an official would bellow, which meant Indians should obey as a child would his father. But the matrilineal North Carolina Indians saw father in a wholly different light. Since father was from a different clan as his biological children, he could not discipline someone in a different clan, even his own children. So father was seen as a gift giver whose job it was to spoil his children, not discipline them. That job belonged to mother's brother or older brother. So when Indians heard great father, they didn't think authority. They imagined gifts and good things coming to them. So lines would be drawn in the dirt between the English and the Indians, and someone would cross it. Words said that couldn't be taken back. Tempers flared, and then real violence was a possibility, especially toward the Indians, who always worried about being murdered by settlers, and many were. By 1711, Lawson, the most knowledgeable Englishman in the colony when it came to Indians, seemed sadly blinded to the reality that Indians saw him as a land taker and a threat to their existence. On one hand, Lawson found much to admire about Indians: their generosity, their hospitality, bravery, stamina, dexterity, and manual skills. He seemed to like them. He helped build a coffin for a Tuscarora man who had been struck by lightning. For a while, he lived with an Indian roommate down on the Neuse River. He was amazed that an Indian could expertly carve a gun stock out of a piece of wood, and that if Indians didn't have musket balls for their guns, they ingeniously used alligator teeth instead. He felt their medicine was head and shoulders above English medicine, and believed Indians had much to teach European doctors. Overall, he found Indians to be good people, and he wrote that they are better to us than we are to them. On the other hand, Lawson was just fine with Indians being taken as slaves, put to work for Englishmen, and money made off their skills and labor. He was okay with settlers taking Indian land as long as Indians got paid for it. That's what he did as a surveyor, essentially transferred Indian land to the lord's proprietors, who then sold it to settlers. Lawson, like most Europeans in North Carolina at the time, didn't take Indians all that seriously. His business client, Baron Christoph de Graffenried, whom Lawson convinced to settle about 350 Germans and Swiss at the mouth of the Neuse River in 1710, saw them as children, clowns, or just dressed up apes. Indian problems and complaints were to be ignored or played down, and Indians just jollied along and laughed at until de Graffenried got what he wanted. Once when de Graffenried and one of his Swiss carpenters visited the Neuse Indian town of Chautauqua, near present-day New Bern, the carpenter spotted an Indian effigy in the middle of town. It was a religious icon consisting of a large tree post stuck in the ground with two faces carved in it. One face looked toward the rising sun and was painted red and white. The face on the opposite side gazed at the setting sun and was painted red and black. The red and black face offended the carpenter, as those were the colors of his hometown flag of Bern, Switzerland. To see them in what he considered the face of Satan was just too much. He took his axe and chopped off the red and black face and later bragged about it. King Taylor of the Neuse Indians was outraged, but de Graffenried merely tut-tutted and played it in all-in fun. It was only a wicked idol, and the man had only destroyed the evil face, he explained. If it had been the good face, he would have chastised him, but he would tell him not to do it again. You can bet this kind of insult got reported to the Tuscaroras, who saw themselves as the older brothers of the Neuse, Corrs, Mattamuskeet, White Oak River Indians, and Bay River Indians of the area. So for a guy who had been studying Indians for a decade, Lawson seemed amazingly obtuse to the problems Indians faced. It was not unusual, as the North Carolina government seemed almost criminally ignorant of what was happening among the Indians just steps beyond the line of settlement. Still, had he bothered to pay attention, Lawson would have seen that all was not well with native peoples. Even he wrote of these problems, but didn't seem to see them as problems. Let me have a sip of water here. For example, Lawson told the story of a party of Seaweed Indians who lived along the South Carolina coast, not far from Charleston. The Seaweeds were convinced that they were being cheated by English traders, having to give way too many deer hides for the guns, kettles, cloth, and such they received in exchange. These goods, which were once luxuries, had now become necessities, especially the guns. If your enemies had guns, then you better have guns too, and powder and shot as well. So traders gouged the Seaweeds, demanding increasing numbers of deer hides for these necessities. And it took many days to process a single deer hide to be used in the trade. It had to be hunted, skinned, scraped, rubbed, stretched, dried, and transported. A lot of woman hours went into producing just one deer hide. Her hands and knees ached after hours and hours of kneeling to scrape meat and hair off the hide, and then kneading it with a concoction of deer brains to make it supple. All the bending made her back hurt, and she remained stiff and sore for days afterwards. And that was just one deer hide. A family needed scores, if not hundreds, to get through the year. So the traders charged high prices, and the Seaweeds, allies of the English, seemed to process more and more deer hides, but wound up with fewer and fewer goods to show for them. It was putting them at the mercy of their enemies. They were certainly at the mercy of the South Carolina traders. They had to find an alternative. And then someone came up with the plan. If they could get their deer hides directly to buyers in England, the source of the goods they wanted, and cut out the Carolina middleman, then they figured they'd get a much better price for their hides. The Seaweeds were quick learners when it came to capitalism. So several of them lashed a few canoes together, rigged up a sail, stowed several hundred deer hides in the bottom, as well as food and water for a long trip. And then they set off into the Atlantic. They made it a mile or two into the ocean before a large swell capsized the canoe, spilling the seaweeds and the deer hides into the deep. The hundreds of hides were lost. All that hard work and woman hours wasted. But the seaweeds treaded water for a while until an English ship appeared and plucked them out of the waves. But instead of taking them back home, the ship's captain enslaved them and sold them to buyers at the next port. Lawson thought the whole scheme was just hilarious, a real thigh slapper. For him, it showed just how foolish Indians could be. But he didn't ask the hard questions on why Seaweeds would attempt this in the first place. And the Seaweed failure didn't soothe the Indian problems. Resentment toward the English simmered. If Indians believed they were being cheated by the English, they knew they were being abused by them. During his trip across the Piedmont, Lawson and his comrades stopped at Indian villages and often spent a night or two. There they talked with village leaders, listened to Indian stories, and just observed Indian life. Sometimes when their party arrived at a village, they were offered female companionship. After a little prying, Lawson discovered among these Piedmont villages the existence of an institution called the trading girls. This was a recent Indian invention, or accommodation, to control the raging libidos of visiting Englishmen and their lewd behavior toward Indian women. Englishmen from rules-bound Britain often gave in to their darker impulses when they got out among the Indians. In the villages, they would often do things they would never have done back in English society. In their mind, Indian women were highly sexual, nymphomaniacs, always ready for sex. Of course, it wasn't true, but it was not uncommon for a British visitor to assault and rape honorable wives, daughters, and nieces. This created a problem, as these Piedmont villages had already become dependent upon these manufactured goods. If an outraged husband beat his wife's rapist, then later Virginia or South Carolina traders might bypass the village, and they'd be cut out of receiving the needed goods. If they killed the abuser, they might face military retaliation from the colony. So what to do when a visiting Englishman raped a kinswoman? And so these Indians created the trading girls. These were young women of the village, selected for the job after much discussion with their families. You could tell them by the way they wore their hair. So when an English trader or an explorer such as Lawson visited and showed any lusty proclivity, a trading girl would appear. She was usually assigned by the village chief, and she would make a temporary marriage with him. She would be his wife while he remained in the village and perform all her wifely duties, cooking his food, cleaning his clothes, sleeping with him, looking after his needs. But the trader was also expected to fulfill his husbandly duties. And since he was only there temporarily, the only way he could do that was to provide for his wife and her family by giving them trade goods, the guns, clothes, beads, and the like, just as any husband would take care of his wife and her family. As per Indian custom, these goods would go to the girl's family and some to the village chief who helped arrange the marriage. Lawson saw it all in strictly economic terms and the girls as mercenaries, but it was an Indian solution to a European problem. So while the trading girls provided a safe and seemingly lucrative method of redirecting English lust, one can still imagine the brooding distaste Indians might have toward these English visitors. Whether Lawson ever made a marriage with a trading girl or not, we don't know. But he was very visibly part of the loss of land that Indians complained about. As I said earlier, to many Indians of eastern North Carolina, Lawson was the specter hanging over every bit of land that got taken from them. And Indians needed a lot of land. Eastern North Carolina Indians lived in villages of longhouses that covered several square acres and might be surrounded by a log palisade, often on higher ground overlooking water. Beyond that were scores, if not hundreds of acres of fields of corn, beans, squash, and older native plants tended to by women farmers. Still, that was not enough, as the village needed access to miles of forests, swamps, marshlands, and rivers for deer, bear's oil, fish, firewood, nuts, berries, roots, pottery clay, and river cane for baskets. Even then, every winter, the people of the village would up and move miles away to their hunting quarters, where they spent the cold months taking deer and processing deer hides, leaving only a skeleton crew of old men and women back at the main village. So this was an additional several hundred square miles of needed land. Englishmen took a very dim view of this Indian sprawl. So every Englishman's farm meant less land for the Indians. Settlers were quick to point out their own land boundaries, but were rather lackadaisical when it came to recognizing Indian boundaries. As the land filled with settlers, aided by Lawson's surveying, there were soon places Indians couldn't go where they once had. Walking into the settlements or hunting on settler land often brought a beating. Settlers, angered at seeing an Indian near their property, might confiscate any game the Indian hunter had shot, then break their guns and order him off the lands with a kick or a slap. More times than you'd imagine, an Indian might wind up murdered by a neighboring settler. So for the Indians of North Carolina's coastal plain, by 1711, the Algonquian-speaking Mattamuskeets and the Iroquoian-speaking Bay River Indians, Neuse, Corrs, and White Oak River Indians had been boxed in, surrounded by haughty settlers who saw little good in their Indian neighbors and usually only as marks to be taken advantage of. The colonial government ignored Indian complaints, so the Indians turned to King Hancock of the Contentnia Creek Tuscaroras and King Tom Blunt of the Tar River Tuscaroras. These were two powerful leaders who commanded much influence among the Indians of eastern North Carolina. Hancock's more southerly Tuscarora warriors saw this abuse up close and personal and grew increasingly angry at the English colony. Even more dangerous for the Indians was that not only were surveyors curtailing Indian land access to land by creating settler farms and plantations, but soon the colonial government ordered that Indians themselves live within lands that had been surveyed and allocated by the colonial government. In 1677, North Carolina fought a brief war with the Seaweed Indians who lived in the Albemarle just east of the Seaweed River. The Seaweeds were defeated, and the colony assigned them a land reserve of 12 miles by 12 miles. In 1704, it would be reduced to 6 miles by 6 miles, or 36 square miles. So now, whether they wanted to admit it or not, once Indians were assigned to a land reserve, they became tributaries of North Carolina, but also forfeited any claims to lands outside their reserve. It was a tremendous loss of land for the Indians. The Seaweed Reserve was the first reservation in North Carolina. It would not be the last. The powerful Tuscarora sat just west of what might be called the line of settlement and listened to the complaints of the Coors, Bay Rivers, and Neuse Indians. Then in 1710, Lawson led about 350 of Christophe de Graffenried's German and Swiss settlers to their new home at the mouth of the Neuse River, where they founded the town of Newbern. They displaced the Neuse Indian town of Chautauqua and sent it further up the Neuse River. The English had now come to Tuscarora country, particularly that southerly region of the colony in which King Hancock of Catechna Town on Contentnia Creek had influence. Though de Graffenried complained that he had paid for the land Chautauqua sat on 3 times over, and so had done justice to the Neuse Indians, it had not gone down without violence. When one of King Taylor's principal men spoke against the land sale, de Graffenried's business partner, a drunken Louis Michel, lit into the Indian, savagely beating him before he could be pulled away. Michel brooded and drank for the rest of the day, then returned to the Indian village that night. Once again he found the man and began beating him a second time. How dare he speak against the land deal? De Graffenried had to be summoned in the middle of the night to restrain Michel and send him away. The Indians were appalled. As King Taylor said, if Christians made peace and alliances after that fashion, he didn't want to have anything to do with them. So Lawson didn't always keep good company, and he was getting a bad reputation among the Indians of eastern North Carolina. And the terrible thing was, he didn't see it. Maybe it was just his ego. After all, he was a colonial official, published author, rising landholder, politically connected, a man on his way to becoming a North Carolina success story. He already was a success story in English eyes. Maybe it was just his sense of English superiority. He was Anglo-Saxon, a Christian, a gentleman, and they were, well, Indians. He imagined they were like children and could be humored and misdirected with a few trade goods, a shot of rum, and promises that would never be kept. And he was John Lawson, damn it. It blinded him to Indian problems, blinded him to the fact that Indians were mad and he was part of the problem, and blinded to the fact that Indians weren't children and couldn't just keep being humored or misdirected. And much too late for him, he would soon find himself up against some very wily Indian politicians who were every bit as capable as Lawson himself, even more capable. So with that in mind, in September 1711, Lawson made a fatal miscalculation. For weeks, he had been pestering de Graffenried about heading up the Neuse River to check out the land. De Graffenried's German colony was starting to prosper, and he wanted to expand it. Up the Neuse was the most logical place to look. And Lawson, the Surveyor General of the colony, would sell it to him. So the two wanted to know how far upriver the Neuse was navigable by boat, especially in drought years. They also wanted to see if there was a good spot to blaze a road from those upriver lands to the Virginia ports. But going up the Neuse would take them into the heart of King Hancock's Tuscarora country. De Graffenried was nervous about that. Still, Lawson was persuasive, and the Baron finally agreed to the trip. In early September 1711, they headed up the Neuse in a small boat, rowed by 2 enslaved Africans, while 2 Indians who could speak English scouted on horseback along the riverbank. The miscalculation was not acknowledging that King Hancock of Catechna Town on nearby Contentnia Creek, about where the town of Grifton is today, was the leader in this area. That was actually common knowledge. A smart man like Lawson should have steered the boat up the Neuse, then up Contentnia Creek to Catechna, paid his respects to King Hancock as an ally who deserved diplomatic respect. But he ignored this important man. Didn't even bother to send a runner to inform him that a couple of high-powered North Carolina government officials were coming into his territory. Lawson ignored all the niceties and formalities that were so important in Indian diplomacy. So on the 3rd day of the trip, when they passed the confluence of Contentnia Creek, they just continued up the Neuse. While they were passing Contentnia Creek, one of Lawson's Indian scouts rode his horse into King Hancock's town of Catechna. This caused a stir, as an Indian astride a horse was not then a common sight in the villages. The Tuscaroras interrogated the rider and found out that 2 North Carolina officials were in their territory, unannounced, scouting lands. And the telling, the Indians seemed to recognize that one of the English was Lawson and believed the other was the newly appointed Governor Edward Hyde. Angry at this slight, King Hancock sent his warriors to intercept Lawson's boat and tell them to sail back around Contentnia Creek and come visit them at Catechna as diplomacy demanded. Something seemed to get garbled in Hancock's instructions to his warriors. So when Lawson and de Graffenried's boat tied up for the evening, suddenly 60 Tuscarora warriors stepped out of the bushes. Instead of turning the boat around, the warriors took Lawson, de Graffenried, and the 2 enslaved Africans as captives and quick marched them back to Catechna. There, in the middle of the night, they deposited the 4 frightened men in front of King Hancock. This was not what King Hancock wanted. Yes, he wanted the officials to return to Catechna and pay their diplomatic respects to him, but he didn't want them here as captives. It didn't take long to identify the 2 men as Lawson and de Graffenried, not the governor. Still, 2 high-ranking colonial officials had been taken captive. Hancock knew there could be hell to pay, but he hoped to work his way out of this with as little damage as possible. But his warriors, a strong faction who had to be listened to and who were tired of English abuses, were wanting more extreme action. Still, Hancock may have been able to pull this off had he made a very un-Machiavellian move, but a move well within the dictates of Indian politics. Instead of handling this himself, after the 4 men had been set before him, King Hancock sent runners to all the other Indian villages in eastern North Carolina, explaining that he had English officials as captives and wanted their counsel on how to handle this. Arriving at a consensus among the groups was an important aspect of Indian political life. Maybe he could get their backing, soothe the feelings of Lawson and de Graffenried, and get out of this without too many repercussions. In the meantime, King Hancock and his council interrogated Lawson and de Graffenried. The 2 men swore it was all a mistake, that they were just upriver looking for wild grapes and how they could make better trade relations with the Tuscaroras. Hancock made his displeasure known, and de Graffenried was apologetic. Even Lawson was somewhat humbled. Hancock announced that they could leave the next morning and hopefully they'd learn their diplomatic manners. When morning came, they didn't leave fast enough. Earlier that morning, the Indian kings from nearby villages began arriving at Catechna, and one of them was Core Tom, leader of Core Town, at the confluence of the Neuse River and Contentnia Creek. Lawson and de Graffenried had passed it a day ago. We don't know much about Core Tom, but we do know he hated the English. I believe that he was a Seneca agent provocateur, doing Iroquois dirty work by stirring up a war between the Tuscaroras and the North Carolina colony. So Core Tom, a wily politician and Indian orator, took the warrior side and demanded that Lawson and de Graffenried be interrogated again in front of everyone. Let everyone hear Lawson's answers. And so as the Englishmen and Africans were gathering their belongings, the Indians again seized the 4 men, roughly stripped them down naked, and set them out in the village square before a great fire. The Indians rifled through their clothes and baggage. They found a straight razor in Lawson's pocket. Much to de Graffenried's anguish, they snatched the wig off his head and threw it in the fire. He complained bitterly about losing that wig. And there they sat for hours into the evening. De Graffenried muttered prayers, thinking they were going to be executed. Now the men went on trial. Lawson and de Graffenried had friends and defenders in the crowd. De Graffenried spotted King Taylor and other Indian leaders he knew and appealed to them as best he could. Poor Tom took over the prosecution, and he was good at it. He reminded the warriors and other Indian kings of the abuses they and their people had suffered at the hands of the English. How everywhere that Lawson went, insufferable settlers soon followed, and that meant less land for them. The warriors surely nodded in agreement when Poor Tom recited the insults, abuses, and murders their people had suffered, all which could be traced back to Surveyor Lawson. Poor Tom could have also thrown in the Indian slave trade, in which English Indian allies attacked other English Indian allies and enslaved them, never to be seen by their families again. How everyone cowered at the least rustle of leaves, fearing that Catawbas and Yamasees out of South Carolina lurked in the woods, ready to take captive any unfortunate woman or child in the wrong place at the wrong time. This very territory here around Goldsboro was burned over with Indian slave raids. These hapless captives would soon find themselves enslaved, in chains, and marched off to Charleston. There they were sold to buyers, then shipped to Barbados or other colonies to be owned by other Englishmen to work for them the rest of their lives. And you didn't live long as an Indian slave. It wasn't hard for Poor Tom to get the gallery on his side. Increasingly baleful eyes were turned on Lawson. Then Poor Tom began to question Lawson directly and insisted the colonial official defend himself. Instead, Lawson lost control. He had sat through hours of accusations and now had had enough of this. His privilege kicked in, and when he should have been quiet, or at least careful, his temper got the best of him. Rather than defend his actions, Lawson threatened his captors. He probably rained hellfire down on them, telling of the revenge that he was going to take on them for these insults. De Graffenreid tried to shut him up, but Lawson raged on. "I made every effort to get Lawson to quit his quarreling," De Graffenreid said, "but I could not succeed. I reproached him bitterly and told him that his imprudence was the cause of our misfortune and that we had nothing better to do than to make peace with our God, and that we did with great zeal." And that's when everything turned. Lawson lost all sympathy there might have been for him among the Indians. Poor Tom had goaded him, and the Surveyor General had fallen for it. If Lawson could do to them all that he promised, then there was little reason to keep him alive, and all the more reason to make a preemptive military strike against the colony itself. If hell was coming, then let's strike the first blow, especially as the North Carolina colony seemed weak and disorganized. De Graffenreid's prayers worked, and his life was spared. He was led away from the area, one of his captors congratulating him on his pardon. Lawson was left bound and naked in the ceremonial ring and seemed to understand that his time was up. De Graffenreid looked back, and Lawson took leave from me and told me to say farewell in his name to his friends. De Graffenreid wasn't allowed to speak to the condemned man, but tried to show him my compassion by a few signs. De Graffenreid would be kept prisoner at Catechna for another 6 weeks until he signed a treaty of peace and friendship with the Tuscaroras and their allies, along with a promise of lots of trade goods. The Indians never got the trade goods. Well, Lawson's time on earth was up, and he was duly executed. It should be remembered that he wasn't ambushed along the trail or killed in some long-forgotten Indian raid, but he was given a 2-day trial in which he was both supported and condemned by Indians, where he got to speak in his own defense. Essentially, he got his day in court. Unfortunately, he blew it. How he was executed has been one of North Carolina's great myths. Christopher Gale, the colony's Chief Justice, but who was nowhere near Catechna when Lawson was executed, said the Indians stuck slivers of pine lightwood throughout his body and set them on fire. He would have died in agony like a fiery porcupine. But this is not what happened. Gale was later sent to South Carolina to convince them to make war on the Tuscaroras, and the more horror he could play up, the better. In reality, Lawson's throat was cut with his own straight razor. Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, who had an excellent intelligence service in Indian country to the many Virginia traders who ventured into eastern North Carolina, confirmed it. Even one of the enslaved Africans with Lawson in de Graffenried, and who witnessed the execution, later told de Graffenried that Lawson had his throat slit. It doesn't really matter, he was just as dead. So the man who considered himself a friend of the Indians, and certainly the most knowledgeable man in the colony about Indian culture, was himself executed by those same Indians. Of course, it was also a fateful decision for King Hancock, the Tuscaroras, and his core Bay River, Mattamuskeet, and White Oak River Indian allies. Realizing that the colony would have to respond to their execution of a high-ranking colonial official, the Catechna Alliance, as I call it, decided to strike first. In the early morning of September 22nd, 1711, hundreds of Alliance warriors hit the English and German settlements from the Pamlico River in the north to the White Oak River in the south. Houses, barns, and ships went up in flames. Over 140 English, Germans, and Africans were killed. Many more wounded and about 30 to 40 taken captive. The Tuscarora War was on. It would end 4 years later in February 1715 and would take 2 military expeditions from South Carolina to destroy Indian forts at Catechna and Neohoroka. By the end of the war, King Hancock had been captured and executed. Corps Tom had disappeared, and we don't know what happened to him. Many of the Catechna Alliance nations had been destroyed, with hundreds of Indians killed and close to 1,000 taken captive, enslaved, and marched off to the slave pens of Charleston, South Carolina. Surviving Indians were turned into North Carolina tributaries and assigned to reservations. All other their lands were taken from them. Indian power in eastern North Carolina had been smashed. We can trace it all back to John Lawson. In fact, we live in a North Carolina shaped by John Lawson and his death. He certainly was not what I would consider a bad man, though others might well disagree and would have a good point. Still, he seemed more understanding of Indians and their culture than most English people of the day. But he was also a man of his own time, culture, and position, and he could only go so far. His execution should be remembered because it was a historical tipping point. The war his death instigated, as I said, broke the power of the Indians of eastern North Carolina. The North Carolina colony, which barely survived the initial attack, its existence would never again be threatened by Native Americans. The Catechna Alliance defeat turned them into tributaries, and once settled on their own land reserves, it opened up the Piedmont and the Cape Fear River Valley to English settlement. With Indian power suppressed, it also opened the area to an increasing number of enslaved Africans. Farms, plantations, and slavery proliferated. Not having to worry about Indians anymore, North Carolina, like the rest of the South, became a slave society where everything and everyone was seen in black and white. This leads us to the Civil War and afterwards, and shapes our world to this day. That's a lot to put on the shoulders of one man. Still, I wonder what Lawson would have thought of it all. Live for 20 more years and die in obscurity, or have your throat cut, which starts a major war, and your name and story lives on forever? I don't know. But that John Lawson, we're still talking about him. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. La Vere. If anybody has any questions, if you'll just raise your hand, and I'll come to you with the microphone.
Well, okay. It was a good lecture. I must have answered them all. Any on YouTube?
Okay, hold on one second.
Wonderful lecture.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
And I
Thank
learned so much. Did Lawson leave a family in the Carolinas?
Like I said, he had a common law wife. I want to say her name was Isabel, and a child with him. And she is tied up in court because when he died, he didn't have a will, and it was intestate. And so that's how I know about it, just reading that little bit. So yes, he had a wife and a daughter.
And his base of operations would have been New Bern or Bath?
New Bern, but also up in Edenton, which Edenton wasn't Edenton then. It was called Queen Anne's Creek and wasn't fully, but that wasn't fully a town, but that's where usually the General Assembly and the governors lived. Edenton was founded as, it became the town of Edenton, I want to say like in 1717 when Governor Charles Eden died.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you for coming out
Levere.
tonight.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you.